Hello and welcome to Language of the Soul podcast. I'm your host, Dominic Domingo.
And I'm your co-host, Virginia Grenier.
We'd like to invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy some inspiring conversation. Here at Language of the Soul, we know that life is story. Individually, we're the products of the stories we tell about ourselves. Culture is the amalgamation of the stories we weave about the human condition. Here's the thing. Individually and collectively, we can write our own story. Thanks for tuning in and joining in the march toward human potential. Hi guys. Thank you so much for joining us today on Language of the Soul. I wanted to give everybody a heads up just on the chance that any of our listeners have abandonment issues. I will not be joining Virginia today. Unfortunately, a very dear friend of the family has passed, and I will be at a memorial. But Virginia will be manning this ship and interviewing our guest who's been on before. It's John Bukowski. He was awesome and had a lot to offer last time, and I'm banking on the fact that he will bring some pearls of wisdom to the table again. He has a lot to say, not just about the why part of the storytelling equation, but the craft, the technique. I think there are a lot of schools of thought out there about what constitutes good writing and good storytelling. So enjoy. He'll have a lot to offer, I'm sure. And I will be reading John's bio like normal, and then Virginia will be manning the interview. Again, thanks for tuning in and enjoy. Over a 40-year career, John Bukowski has gone from veterinary practitioner to epidemiologist to medical writer to fiction writer. With 2 doctorates and a master's, John identifies as the most overeducated fiction writer in the country. He currently authors short fiction and fast-paced thrillers such as Project Suicide, and most recently, Checkout Time, a 2024 finalist for both the Silver Fashion and Imagine Awards. John grew up in a factory worker family of 8 in Motown. At each step along his path, John has needed to embrace change and tackle the challenges of a new direction. Each step has made him a stronger writer. He loves chatting about his journey from science to fiction and the process he uses to turn what-if scenarios into novels and short stories. John has extensive experience in public speaking, including numerous appearances on theatrical stages, TV, radio, podcasts, seminars, workshops, civic groups, and book clubs. Welcome, John Bukowski.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
You're welcome. The one thing that we've changed since you've been on is we have started, Nick has started asking pretty much like this just general question of all of our guests in this new season. So I'm going to ask that. So basically the general question that we just ask, which goes right to the heart of our podcast here at Language of the Soul, is with the understanding that there are very real existential threats to our survival. What does story mean to you? And with that, how would you say that story helps us tell about the human condition?
Oh, boy. To me, story, as you know, I had a background in science, things like that. Mm-hmm. I kind of focused on that fairly early, but I had a great deal of interest in English reading and writing, history, things like that. So I have multiple interests, multiple things that I excelled at and liked in school. And so for me, story is a great way to get back to that artistic feeling, which with science you kind of lose. Mm-hmm. And so I think when, especially when you talk about story, or if you want to say fiction, sometimes it's not that far from the truth. But you can sometimes frame the truth a little easier when you're dealing with a made-up situation, an artificial situation. Mm-hmm. That's what they always say, like with the old Star Trek and the old Twilight Zone series. Mm-hmm. They were able to discuss important issues, which at the time the censors probably wouldn't have let them discuss because they did them in a science fiction type of thing. So I think that's one of the things that story gives you. It allows people, at least fiction does, it allows people to explore feelings, explore ideas, explore existential threats, as you say, but with a little distance to it. You're not talking about yourself. You're not talking about necessarily anything real. You're talking about something you've created in your mind. And the mind is where, let's face it, we're going to solve these world's problems. It's going to be with our minds.
No, and that's true. And that's, definitely been the whole thing about us and doing this podcast has been very much that. It's like, even though we do talk about story as in technique or the process, or even the the creative process and all of that, at the same time, I mean, to me, and I mean, you brought it up, I mean, how you loved history and all of that. I mean, I really feel that the stories that we create that are fictional to the stories from history that are based in truth, help us understand who we are, as a society and culture, and in general as, of course, humans on this planet. With that said, because I know you have such a unique background, and you do focus in more of that science fiction kind of journey of storytelling. What has your scientific experiences, how have they influenced that creative narrative and helping to tell the stories that, we need to understand where we are now today?
Well, some of my writing, like Project Suicide, my first book, and I have a sequel to it called Bad Pennies that comes out in probably sometime first half of 2025. And those are more techno thrillers, or at least they have a technical aspect to them. And in those situations, I'm using my scientific background to sell the idea. Like they say when you write, say, science fiction, and these are not too far off from science fiction, you need some technical accuracy to build on, because you have to gain the reader's trust. If it's all just made up crap, for want of a better word, they're not going to buy it. But if there's a little bit of, at least it sounds technically plausible, and if that comes across, then they buy into it. Like with a good con man, they don't start off by selling you the Brooklyn Bridge. They start off by all kinds of other things, gaining your trust. Then they try to sell you the Brooklyn Bridge. So I think that's certainly is one part of my writing. But also something that people always joke, I've never used algebra. Well, maybe you never have, but learning algebra, learning story problems, learning learning about the body and how it works, all of that trains you to concentrate, to formulate your thoughts. And that's all important in writing. We also talked about history. I love history. I've been studying, especially military history, for 50 years, probably more. And a knowledge of history is important, not only, like we say, to solve world problems, but in anything you write, there's going to be some historical aspect, whether it's straight historical fiction or historical romance, or if it's either a modern day something, there's going to be some historical reference. And I think that's important, that you know a little bit of that and can impart it.
That makes sense. And I mean, and you think about it too, especially like how you're bringing in, some of that scientific, technical kind of background. I mean, and you brought up, Twilight Zone and Star Trek. I know for both of us, a lot of the stuff that we saw in those type of shows were like, oh, sure. Like, we'll be long gone before we ever see anything like that happen. And now here's AI. I mean, the first thing that went through my mind was, because I love the Terminator series. And I was like, did anybody watch that? Did nobody learn from that movie? Like, hello. I mean, how many movies in the 80s were talking about machines killing us, and here we are, we're creating intelligence in it? Like, did we forget that lesson that we all kind of dreamt about as being, like this?
And you can see the robots that they have now. They walk and they fall down, they can get back up, and they can do tasks and stuff. I mean, humanoid looking after a fashion. So yeah, it's not all just swing arms on assembly lines. Some of the robots are actually androids now.
Right. Right. But I think you're right. I think by understanding, biologically, historically, all of those components of us as, humans and in society, what makes us who we are, where we came from and where we have the potential to be. Those stories really help us grapple with what
Yeah.
we're trying to fix in the future, let alone what we're trying to figure out now, as well. With that said, what would you say have been the traditions that have shaped your understanding of narrative? And in what ways do you think that affects our perception, your perception of truth in today's world?
You're talking about understanding narrative. Is that it?
Yeah, understanding narrative, just understanding just kind of, the various things, that we're seeing when it comes to the fiction writing that we see now, because we're
Okay.
seeing a lot of things in the past that are actually becoming lived
Yeah.
realities to
Well,
where, that
as
bridge is getting small.
yeah, as far as writing technique, I was blessed and cursed with growing up in Catholic school. So you got a lot of traditional English structure.
Hmm.
How you parse a sentence, how things go together, how paragraphs go together. So those things really help to, because a lot of people want to, oh, I don't want to do with any of that. I just want to write. Well, it's like being a mechanic and not having any tools or not understanding how something works. You have to have the basics down first. Now, even if you didn't get that, Stephen King always one of my influences. Stephen King always talks about you pick up most of that from reading.
Hmm.
And that's why I say to people, they say, well, what do you have to do to be a writer? You have to read a lot and you have to write a lot. Uh, Reading, I've been reading since probably I was 7 or 8 years old, and used to spend lots of summer afternoons in the air conditioning of the library in Detroit, reading and taking books home and stuff like that. So I've been reading fiction and history
Hmm.
my entire life. And so just by reading, you pick up how a narrative works, how flow goes, how characters are developed, all that stuff, as well as the language background.
Hmm.
How to structure it. And also, I think things like I'm a big fan of old movies, and we talked about TV shows like Star Trek. They're all stories that are played out over a beginning, middle, and end. Movies are obviously much longer. Miniseries are longer yet, and it's kind of like the difference between a novel and a short story.
Hmm.
One is short with a little punch, and the other one is longer with character development and stuff like that. But you pick up a lot just from watching movies and good television shows. I'm not talking about like a sitcom. You might pick up something, um, but yeah, reading and read the right authors. Just if you want to write thrillers, don't read romance. It's if you want to write romance, don't read mysteries.
Hmm.
It's not to say that you can't read those as well, but try to focus more on the genre you like to write it.
Right. No, that makes sense. And I'm actually a huge Stephen King fan. It's kind of funny. So I fell in love with Stephen King when I was a teenager. Loved the craft. I know people call him the horror writer, the grandfather of horror, but I never felt he was really what I think of horror, like really what a horror writer is, because I always felt like he always was constantly talking about the battle of literally the human condition of good and evil with inside of
Right.
us. The primal man versus the higher man. And I think it was probably reading those books, helping me, look at life in a different way. Like, you can be a good person and do horrible things. You can be a horrible person and do good things, just like a lot of his characters are like. So I do think you gain a lot of that when you read different, types of writers. But this is what I learned from him. And I think honestly, that was probably what propelled me to go into mental health, was because I was so just like in awe of that constant storyline, being like that being like the basic part of all of his writing, to where I was like,
Uh-huh.
I want to understand human behavior better. Like, why
Right.
is that?
Yeah.
So like, who influenced you to kind of do the same thing, but in your genre of writing? Like,
Sure.
what did you find that you're like going, this is why I want to write here, because I keep seeing this constant kind of theme happening, and I want to understand this better.
Well, I write primarily to entertain.
Hmm.
There usually are themes. There's a character arc in it, but that's not while I'm writing. I'm writing so that people will enjoy it, hopefully.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of writers write for that reason. At least I hope so. But my influences, there's three major ones. The first one is Ernest Hemingway,
Hmm.
because he's the first modern American writer who taught us that we don't need long-winded purple prose. We can make a really impact with just short sentences as long as they're put together properly.
Uh-huh.
Second is probably Stephen King. I think he's the king of character development. And he'll even say the reason that most of people, what he does with his stories is he gets you to love his characters and then he messes with them.
Yeah, true.
The first book of his I read was The Shining
Hmm.
when I was actually in college in veterinary school. And it got me looking over my shoulder when I'm outside at night, that kind of thing. And it's the characters, that descent into madness that you talk about, the difference between
Hmm.
good and evil, certainly is evinced in that with Jack Torrance, going down the rabbit hole in the hotel.
Oh yeah.
And the third is uh, Elmore Leonard. I think he's the king of dialogue. I've read most of his books, and I don't know if you know him.
Mm-mm, I don't.
He is. Do you like the show Justified?
I have not seen that
Oh, okay.
actually.
With that was a very popular show a few years ago, cable show. He did that. He did a
Hmm.
bunch of westerns early on. He did movies. He did books like the source material for Get Shorty and Jackie Brown, and so a lot of his more later writing. He's passed away a few years ago, but his later writing had to do with kind of crime novels and thrillers, and those are he's the king of dialogue. If you read his dialogue enough, you pick
Hmm.
up how to write dialogue properly. I think that's important for dialogue. And I've had a background in theater as well, community theater,
Okay.
and you read a lot of scripts, and scripts
Hmm.
are nothing but dialogue and stage direction.
Right.
So you pick up dialogue that way. And I like other writers too. I like some of Robert Parker's thriller novels, some of Stephen Hunter,
Hmm.
Michael Crichton. Certainly, he was an influence as the techno thriller genre, which I like to write in sometimes. And so, yeah, those are. I kind of gravitated to thriller because it's kind of just how my narrative mind works.
Hmm.
When I think, for example, when I first came up with the idea for Project Suicide, or excuse me, for Checkout Time, which is my second book about a
Hmm.
hotel bomber who's trying to extort money. Um, I saw a trapdoor in a hotel room. I looked up at the ceiling and I said, huh, you could put something in there. And I started thinking of things like, what would you put in there? You could put jewels. And so you've got a jewel heist and somebody finds the mob's jewels or money. You could put microfilm or the equivalent electronic item up there. You've got a spy thriller. So it immediately went to thriller. And so that's just kind of how my mind works.
No, that makes sense. I mean, and writing in the thriller genre, I mean, it's definitely like crafting puzzles. And I'm just kind of curious, when you think about it, if you look at like on a larger scale, and I'm going to kind of bring this more into a cultural perspective. Do you think on that larger cultural scale that the purpose of, thrillers are kind of to help us reflect and to kind of go through our own anxieties and problem solve our own, like to help us be better about those skills and building those and guiding us through them, kind of like an intrinsic part of our
Yeah,
human
yeah.
nature.
I think they're just like horror. I think they're a form of therapy.
Mhm.
With a thriller, you get the excitement, and then the good resolution. So
Mhm.
like with a horror, you get people like to be scared. They like to experience fear, experience anxiety, the rush
Mhm.
of a action type of thing in a safe environment.
Right.
That's kind of what, if you think about it, what psychologists do. If you have a fear of flying, they gradually work you through that,
Mm.
going higher and higher uh, in to face that fear in a safe environment.
Right.
And so, yeah, so I think you're right. Yeah, I think it is a form of therapy. Reading is therapeutic. It's also, I remember loving the Lord of the Rings trilogy and reading it multiple times when I was a teenager.
Mhm.
And it took you to another world that was different. It was almost a flashback in time to a gentler time, kind of
Mhm.
like the Waltons. I used to like that too. It was same kind of thing. Takes you to a gentler time, uh, and that good and evil. That was certainly Lord of the Rings and things like that that you talked about before. That's certainly in evidence there.
Right. Yeah. And I feel like it helps us make more sense of the at least when I sit down to write or when I'm reading a book, I tend to find I pick up something or write something that pertains to what I'm going through in some way, personally, on some level. So it seems like if I'm feeling more nostalgic or um, needing that connection with relationship, I'll probably pick something up that's more romance or maybe like Little Women or something more like that versus if I'm going through like grief or something like that, I might pick up something that's going to transport me that's more of like a magical fairy tale kind of, where I can just solve everything by a wave of a wand kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. And it's interesting how literature does that, how it helps us kind of mentally like you said, like reading Lord of the Rings, how it transports you into another world. Like books really do that, and I just think that's just so interesting that authors are able to just grab us and pull us into wherever we need to be to work through things, without
Yeah.
realizing it on a very subconscious level. So I'd love for you to tell me a little bit about the book that you have coming out in 2025 that is the second book to
Right.
Project Suicide.
It's a sequel to Project Suicide, which was a story of a. I'll just recap. Was a story of a how a Alzheimer's treatment gets perverted into an assassination drug.
Hmm.
And high-profile politicians start killing themselves, and only a drunken genius can save the country. Well, our drunken genius is back with his girlfriend or his aide, Amy, and there's somebody from the past from the original Project Suicide that is making trouble. And Deacon Creel, my protagonist, is drawn again into finding a cure for Project Suicide and also trying to stay alive from this evil presence from the past.
Hmm.
So that's the new book, and it's right now we're at a stage where we've got the front matter and stuff worked out, and I'm currently responding to editorial comments, and hopefully it'll be all set to go sometime in first half of 2025.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm curious, just can you tell us where the inspiration came from your drunken genius? Because I mean I literally think of like so many different characters along those lines. Like I think of House, um, from the TV show House MD and how
Right,
he, was hooked on painkillers, yet he was just like this amazing diagnostic doctor. And then you have, like your typical like mad scientist like in Frankenstein. And it just
right,
and then you think of real life people, like I was just reading about I've seen the movie Beautiful Mind, but I was actually reading some other stuff about um Elliot Nash recently, and I mean, he was an amazing mathematician, but he, of course, was diagnosed with schizophrenia. So
Right.
it's literally, you do see that there's kind of like some kind of bad, be it mentally diagnosed or, like Hawking. I mean, obviously he had his physical, you know, um, things that he had to overcome, but was a genius. So you really have real like people who have to overcome that. I mean, I know with Albert Einstein, they talk about like, that his possibly he was dyslexic. So, but here, and then you see that with actual fictional characters. So did that come from kind of those historical kind of figures that you came up with, like the drunken mad genius, or did it just?
Well, actually, I would say I came up with it for a couple of things. First, I wanted to get away from the standard thriller trope of the ex Navy SEAL, the ex FBI agent, the ex Jack Reacher type of person who now is a crusader, now is the equalizer, who now is Jack Reacher, whatever. And so I used my own background and said, well, we'll make him a scientific genius. He has some military experience as working for uh, uh, the radiological, biological, chemical area in with the CDC, which is a uniform service, Centers for Disease Control. And but I wanted him to have a flaw. I think a lot of people, I'm drawn to flawed characters. And so in his case, he's got a lot of guilt that he carries around. And he's a scientific guy. So the emotional side, he does not know how to handle it. So he handles it poorly through drink. And I think that's a lot of people who, historically, Edgar Allan Poe and others who self-medicated for problems, emotional problems. And so, yeah, that was my rationale for why he would be a drunken genius. I wanted it to be more science than ex-military, and I wanted him to be flawed. So that's where that came from.
No, and I like that because I think, when you think, like the people I mentioned, I mean, obviously we all have flaws. I mean, none of us are perfect, and I think that helps make characters more believable.
And you also, something you mentioned before about you were talking about feeling different ways and stuff. Stephen King, and I don't know if you're familiar with his book, The Dark Half.
I haven't read that one yet.
And he says in there, or at least he does in the movie, I can't remember. I've read the book. I can't remember. He says in the book specifically, this, what I'm going to say is he goes, we're all human beings, multiple. We have the face we show the world. Then we have the face that we hide inside. And a lot of times we all have like wanting to kill people at some time or being very lustful, and we keep those hidden. We don't show them to people. The fiction writer can let them out and show people. The matter of fact, the fiction writer has to do that, just like the actor. You can't play a scene and be repressed. You have to let your emotions come through. You have to let your inner self come through some way. And so that's what I think one of the things writers does for you that's also therapeutic is you can bring out some of these things that you would never act upon in life. That's why it's fun to write villains. I mean, they do all kinds of things which we would never do. And they justify them. That's their right to do it, as it were.
Yeah, and it's true. I mean, I love that that you share what Stephen King shared because it's true. I mean, to be able to create a character, especially a villain type character, and I think most of us in the world consider ourselves good people and would pretty much give our shirt off our backs to somebody in need. Yet when you're sitting down as an author, you have to dig deep. You have to dig into those areas of yourself that you want, that I think everybody in life wants to pretend doesn't exist.
Right.
Like you said, that it's the whole shadow self, as Carl, Jang talks about we've got that darker side of us that does, and we have to be aware of that and be okay with that. Just know, there's rules in society that you can't just act upon.
Well, yeah, that Stephen King even talks about that. He goes,
Hmm.
I've never committed murder. I've never, but my characters have often. That doesn't mean that I am that, but I certainly have it within me to imagine it.
Yes. Well, and I think that's the big thing. I think when it comes to us as humans in general is we can imagine all kinds of possibilities. It's just acting upon those things, be it good, bad, or indifferent. And that's what's so amazing about stories. It, like you said, it allows us to explore those parts of our psyche. It allows us to.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I think it's kind of a shame that we're doing all of this censoring. Is like if you watch, I just saw a clip for Gone with the Wind or a little description
Mhm.
with it, and they say it contains things that might be traumatic for blah 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 blah. It's like, well, it's history, and you can't learn from it if you don't look at it. And I grew up with the Three Stooges, but I never hit anybody in the head with a hammer. It's we should be teaching, especially children, to differentiate what's fictional, what's maybe even done for comedic intent fictionally, with reality, and not blur that line. Say this is the line.
Yeah, it does feel sometimes within our society that we're starting to blur those lines a little bit, and I wonder if that's to our own detriment. I mean, I think about, and not that I want, and nor nor does Nick ever want anybody to feel that they're being patronized or isolated or ostracized by any ways. I mean, because the reality is we all have. It takes all of us. We honestly believe it takes a village to march forward, toward progress. But with that said, at the same time, if we don't talk about the things that are not good, or understand, like, hey, it's okay to laugh at ourselves and it's okay to imagine these crazy things, but it doesn't mean we should go actually do that,
Right.
you know.
I'm a student of history, as I said.
Mhm.
And that's one thing. If you study history, you see that people did all kinds of terrible things and they were accepted in the past. That was the society that they lived in, was a
Mhm.
harsher time, harsher methods. When you talk about things like, for example, slavery, that was the common thing prior to like 1800 throughout the world. Uh, certainly Romans, Greeks, any society you look at, the Aztecs, the Incas, whatever, slavery was an aspect of it. So, yeah, it doesn't mean we have to do it now, but as a historian, you look at things within the time period that people lived. I think sociologists, to a certain degree, archaeologists, uh, people who study old civilizations and stuff, they have to do that as well. You can't really judge the people based on modern uh, mores or whatever. You have to judge them based on the time period that they live in.
Right. Yeah. And I love that you just said it, because stories do often, act as the mirror to society's values and fears in the time in which they happened. Um, and I think it's easy to have that whole, hindsight's 2020, like to take what we now know and apply it to somebody
Right.
100 years in the past. Like they they didn't have that knowledge, or they didn't have that awareness.
Right.
Um,
Or that experience. Yeah.
yeah. In your opinion, what do you feel are the popular narratives of today? What do they say about us as a culture? What would you say is probably what we're saying now in our storytelling?
I'm not sure I understand.
So, like, because there's a lot of different, movies have come out recently. Obviously the publishing industry and books has gotten really big. We've got people who can self-publish to the big publishers. So I'm just kind of curious because stories do act as that mirror to society's values and our own fears. I'm just curious, in your opinion, what do you feel are some of the narratives today, like what they're saying about us as a culture? Like, do you ever think about that?
Yeah, that gets down to again this dark half, or the multiple parts of being a person. I think there's a hesitancy now to allow those parts to come out, especially if you're writing historical fiction or whatever. But in all aspects, I think we're seeing writers censoring themselves on what they think no one wants to be canceled, or no one wants to be criticized, or say, if they have a character that maybe is, a person of color who is a villain, people would be hesitant to write that now, as if there aren't people in present and past who are villainous who happen to be people of color, just like there are white people who are villainous or whatever. So I think there's a danger there. Because, as Stephen King says, if you can't let that dark half out, then the writing itself is going to be repressed. Just like I said with acting, if you have a character that is living in 1850 in the South, and he acts like a modern day person, that's not going to ring true. So that's why I'm a big fan of studying history. Both so you can look at it without being repulsed by it, and still understand that it's not what we would do today.
Yeah, so it's funny, that balance between accuracy and creative license. And I'm gonna go right down a path that I'm sure Nick's like, I can't believe she just did this. But one of the things that I, with my own children, and they're all girls, and then even with my husband, the one thing that we see a lot happening is, and I'm not saying they aren't there, because I would say I'm probably one of them, but a lot of shows now, it's always like, she's a woman of power. And
right.
I'm a very strong, I identify as female. I am very strong. I'm very opinionated. My husband will tell you I wear the pants in the family, straight up. So yes, do I believe that there are strong females out there? Absolutely. Like, I loved, Annie, Go Get Your Gun. Like, I thought that was an amazing play, and that was a strong female character. However, seeing that in every single book and TV show, like being shoved in my face, I'm going, okay. But there are women who aren't that. And I think not every woman wants to aspire to be that. And so I think that's like kind of an injustice, because it makes, it's kind of, and to play devil's advocate on that, is the flip side is, it's the whole, like, because you're a guy, you have to be macho. And really, it doesn't, I don't care if you're heterosexual, trans, or a gay man, you don't have to be macho. You can have feelings, and you can cry. And so I feel like we're starting to, like, now do that role reversal to the women. Like, no, you've got to be, I mean, we already, as females growing up, like, we have to be everything, but now it's like, now we have to be strong and not show our emotions too. And it's like, really?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I like to write strong female characters. My first two books, Project Suicide and Checkout Time, both have strong female characters. But they're kind of different. The first one, Amy Robbins, she's a strong character. She saves the day in many respects, but she is very much feels she is supporting her mission as a Marine corpsman, is to support the man in charge, and she sees herself in a subservient role to Deacon and to the mission that they're on. Whereas my second book, Sally Pancakes, as they jokingly call her, Sally Butterworth, she's an FBI agent, and she's very strong, and she is kind of take control, and she doesn't do well with that, being second banana to anybody. And I enjoy both types of characters. So you're right. If you're restricted to just one, it gets a little boring.
Yeah. Well, and I, you mentioned the term, subservient, and and I'm gonna not attacking you, so don't think that, John. But I hate that term because I think that's kind of the mentality that's getting planted in women, and I'm, it's not to get all feminist here, but it's like there's that when we hear that term, it's kind of like, oh, so you have to, basically be on bended knee to the alpha male, and it's like,
Yeah. I certainly didn't mean that way. It's
no, no,
probably
no, 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 no.
a better word would be supportive, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's like the thing that I'm starting to see, though, like message wise, like that's how that's being portrayed. Like that one character, like that's what they're doing. Like they're bowing down to like the man, to the patriarchy, and I'm like, sometimes I think you need somebody who understands that which is why I think you're going with that character, where they're not worrying about who the person is in charge, because the role is the ultimate. I always think of like Spock, the need of the one doesn't outweigh
Right.
the need of the many. And I think sometimes we forget that in the
Right.
society. And I think stories help us remember that, like, hey, it doesn't matter, male, female, whatever gender identity you want to go with. The ultimate goal is the whole, not us individually. And when we start to focus on like those key things, like that's why I was bringing that up, like, like, oh, I'm being subservient. Well, really, are you? Because now you're thinking individually, not collectively. Like what?
But and you could think of it just like as a workplace. If you're in a workplace team,
Mhm.
not everybody's the leader. There's a hierarchy,
Yeah.
and you may play a supportive role to accomplish the projects or whatever you're working on. Certainly, it's the case in the military. It's the case in society everywhere. Almost every place there is a hierarchy, and most people are supporting that. They provide support services rather than being the one who gives the orders.
Right. We're all cogs in the machine, right?
Yeah, in some respects, if you want to think about that, hopefully it's not like them. It's not like that. Like I've known people who worked on the assembly line in Detroit,
Yeah.
and that can be soul crushing. But,
Yeah, hopefully you're not a soul crushing cog. Hopefully you feel like your purpose is, if you go out, the whole machine stops working, and that's a problem. So therefore you feel like you have a purpose to contribute.
right, and you contribute to the greater good, as you say.
Mhm. Yeah. No, and I think, ultimately that's what story does. It helps us remember those things that, sometimes we're going to be, we can be in a leadership role. Sometimes we're going to be in a serving role. And sometimes we can be in both roles at the same time. Because I mean, just because you're leading doesn't mean you're not serving, because just because everybody beneath you who's helping to support you and the mission that you're on with them doesn't mean that they can't see that you are also in that position with whoever's above you. I think we forget it's kind of like a ladder, that we're all helping each other up that ladder.
Right, and you can think of it too with writing, painting, any creative endeavor or hobby. It's a way to be the creative one, be the one who sets the tone, whether it's what you're painting or what you're writing. Even though you may work at the post office where you're just serving people all day or something like that.
Hmm. Yeah, no, and I do see how storytelling, is a means to entertain, to educate, to help us instigate change, and even and obviously all of those. I honestly think. How do you think your stories are impacting people? I mean, I know they're there to entertain, but do you
Well,
think
I
it's
think
also?
I give a little bit of education too. That's one of the things I love about Michael Crichton's writing, whether it's
Mhm.
Jurassic Park or Andromeda Strain or whatever, and it shows up in his movies as well. You get a little behind the scenes look, and you get a little education on the scientific method, how investigations are done, that kind of thing. So I try to do a little of that without making it, a technical manual, without making it boring.
Mhm.
So certainly that. And likewise in checkout time, I tried to give a little bit behind the scenes of things like the FBI. I actually toured an FBI office in Knoxville, field office, for checkout time. and you pick up little bits and pieces which you can then add to authenticity to the story that gives it a little bit more flavor. It gets it as if you can think, I'm actually looking back there. I'm actually following along like a movie in the mind. So in that respect, I think education, I hope to pass on a little bit of at least educational experience on the reader, and entertain them, and hopefully give them some relief from like a stressful day or something. You can sit down and read a good book that entertains and takes you to another era and lets you experience that, the thrills and the dangers in a safe environment.
Yeah, no, and I definitely think that's a very universal, goal that authors have, or any creative personality has, and to kind of help thread all that and help us just kind of escape too from our day to day. So, how do individual stories, do you think, contribute to the larger human narrative to help us feel connected?
Well, I mean, I think we all have a connection through what we've read.
Hmm.
It forms your opinions. It educates, those kind of things. So I think in that respect, anybody who's read Stephen King can get together and talk like they're all friends, because they've, if they're a Stephen King fan, for example, or Elmore Leonard fan, you can talk about the books and the movies, and it's a connection that way, where we're all what we've read kind of makes us a family when you follow an author or things like that. So I think that certainly is part of it. And if characters are written well and stuff, and you empathize with them, I think that's also a connection, where people feel other people's pain and suffering.
Yeah, I definitely think it helps us grow an awareness and helps us kind of look at our own biases and things that we're afraid of. Um, I definitely think it helps us kind of get more of that introspective. I know when I've read books, and I know we mentioned Lord of the Rings earlier, like I think, if I was ever tasked with something, like Frodo, would I be able to have that strength and courage? And I mean, and you see, like, he wavers, he questions that himself. So I think it does help us kind of do that. And then when we like are in book clubs, or we find a story that we really love and we want to share it with somebody that, we're friends with, or family, we're like, hey, this is really great. I think we carry over, this is how the story impacted me. Hopefully it impacts you in a similar way.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
very much
agree.
so. Yeah.
I think that's great. So what, looking ahead, what legacy do you hope your stories are going to leave behind? What lasting impressions are you hoping readers are going to carry away from your series?
Well, I hope that people, as I said, number one, be entertained, and say, what, that gave me a little bit of enjoyment and relaxation at a time when I needed it. That this guy writes pretty well. What else has he written? What else can I read like that? That's what I hope to get. We all like to leave a legacy,
Hmm.
and I hope the body of my writing, whatever I can write in the next 20 years or so, anyway, we'll do that.
Hmm.
That people will say, "Hey, this was an enjoyable read. Uh, I thought the characters were real. It touched me. I want to read the next one or the next thing."
No, that's, yeah.
Speaking of which, I do have a
Mhm.
second book coming out in 2025.
Yes.
It is unrelated to the others that I've written.
Oh, okay.
It's called The Peeper,
Oh,
and it's the story of a serial killer who takes his victims from social media, and a kind of milk toast bureaucrat who gets caught up in the search for him and gets framed for him.
That's interesting. Is it just because of all the stuff that's been going on with social media and how we literally like sit with our phones in front of our faces? Is that
Yeah, that's kind of one of the things that it's, and I can be guilty of it too. And it's like you don't know who's on the other end when you're like in a direct message or a chat room or just following somebody along. You don't really know that much about them. And there's potentially dangerous people out there.
Yeah, there is. I don't talk about it. Well, friends and family know, but I don't talk about really ever here on the podcast. But back before dating websites were a thing, and so you would go into like the online gaming scenario, realm was starting to open up and stuff. And so you had like the chat rooms, or you could, if there was like a topic you liked, you could go in there and research more. And they had like the chat rooms where you could talk to the other people. So my husband and I met online.
Okay.
In chat rooms. And we actually conversed for a few months.
He's not a serial killer, is he?
No. And I can honestly say it because he's had to do a psych eval because he actually works in public safety. So I can honestly say, I mean, he may have tendencies, but yeah, he was cleared. He was cleared by the government that he was safe to work. Yeah, we talked back and forth via email and stuff. We didn't even know what each other looked like. When he sent me his picture, I kid you not, John, it looked, so he was, I won't say what, we lived in California at the time. I won't say who he was helping during that time campaign. That way, nobody knows which party line that was affiliated with. But anyways, so he's standing next to that candidate in the photo, but because it was with the campaign poster and stuff behind, when he sent it to me, I thought he literally cut it out of the freaking newspaper and just sent me some random I didn't believe it. Because I was like, how do I know this is really you? Like, for all I know, you cut this out of the newspaper and sent this to me because you found it.
There's always the stories of the pervert, for want of a better term, trying to seduce the young girl or whatever, saying he's also a young girl, and stuff like that. You don't know. You get a picture, you can put it up there. It's
I did not believe him at all. I even had to, like, when he asked me for my phone number, I like gave him my mom's number, and I'd go to her house and take the calls because I was like, there's no way in heck I'm gonna, like, I don't know who you are yet.
I heard somebody joke the other day. They said, I was told as growing up to never get in a car with a stranger. Now I call Uber and get into a car with a total stranger, and
society has changed so much. So I think that's interesting that you have that you're doing a story on that, because even though we've had technologies, I mean, because my kids have grown up with it. So, I mean, technology has been around for 20 years.
Yeah.
In different facets of where it is now today. I mean, those are still real realities to our society that you still don't, even though we're a little bit more trusting.
And that gets us back to that dark half or the multiple personalities of things. A lot of people get depressed because, everybody else on Facebook or on Twitter or whatever is got such a much better life than me. You're just seeing one part of it.
Yeah.
You're seeing what they want to show you. There's the old poem, Simon and Garfunkel made it into a song about Richard Cory, the man who had power, grace, style, money, and one day he goes home and blows his brains out.
Yeah. Well, which makes me actually think of Robin Williams. Every thought, because he was a comedian. He did all these, really deeply introspective movies to comedic movies. And, I remember, because I worked out in LA in the Hollywood area at the time, hearing that he would hire the homeless to work on the productions that he did. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so amazing. He's such an amazing. And then all of a sudden, he took his own life. Nobody knew how depressed he really was.
Yeah. It's my mom used to always say, she passed away a few years ago, but she used to always say, you never know what's really going on.
Yeah, it's so true. And I really feel like that's what art does. It's that the creative collective that helps us reflect, be drawn into story, be it you're looking at a painting and you're getting drawn in, or just what you're, perceiving from the image that you're looking at. I think it's that creative ability that allows us as a society to cope, deal, understand, be introspective in so many aspects of our lives. And if we ever lost the creative side of who we are, I think it would be a detriment if we just went complete. And not that I'm saying AI is going to ever do that, but I always wonder, the more and more we get into technology, like, are we losing those creative parts of who we are?
Yeah, I write short stories too, and you submit, and they're always a thing that says, "Please check that you have not used AI in the writing of this."
Mm-hmm.
And I never use AI, so I check, that that's the case. But I always wonder, is it gotten good enough where something written by AI these people would want to publish? And I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I don't know how good it's gotten, but if is it good enough to fool you as a publisher, as an editor? Would it be that interesting?
Yeah, because I wonder, because it can't empathize, it can't have compassion, it doesn't feel. So yeah, it makes you wonder how much of the human side is missing in its writing compared to authentic humans writing. And the fact that it's so scary that sometimes it can't be detected really makes me concerned about us as humans in this world.
Well, we were talking about social media, and sometimes somebody will, as an author and stuff, you attract people. Sometimes someone will, DM me something, and hi, how are you? Blah 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 blah. And I always think, okay, what are you after? But sometimes they say, you can tell that what they're replying with. You say, well, what do you do? What do you do for a living? And you can see it's almost like an AI generated thing. I am an engineer. I do. Blah, 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 blah. It's like a definition.
Yeah.
And you could say, okay, you're not really who you say you are, or whatever, and just end it right there.
Yeah, it's crazy where it's gotten. But anyways, let's bring it back to because we're getting to the top of the hour here on the podcast. So what would you want to impart to those who are readers, those who are trying to develop their creative, writing ability, artistic side? What would you like to impart to our listeners on that?
Well, as far as writers, there's several things. First of all, read a lot and write a lot. I've heard people say, well, I don't read because I don't want to be influenced by other. It's like, no. You can't learn how to do this without reading good writers. Read as many as you can think of. Read mostly in the genres you want to write, but read widely. So that's what I would say as far as writing goes. And don't have a thin skin. Rejection is not the exception; it's the norm. Stephen King used to say, back before we had computer files and stuff, he'd say, "What you do is you drive a nail into your attic rafter, and every rejection you get, you slip it on that nail. And when it gets all full of rejection slips, then you drive another nail. It just keeps coming." Hopefully, I've been more fortunate. When I first started writing short stories about 10 years ago, if I got one published in a year, I was like ecstatic. Mm-hmm. And I think I've had 9 published this past year.
That's great.
So be persistent, and you've got to treat it like a hobby and a business. It's like a business because you do it every day. You develop a routine. It's like a hobby because of all this rejection. You couldn't do it just for the money or just for the accolades. You have to do it because you enjoy doing it.
Right.
I think that, or you're driven to do it, as some people say. I'm more of an addict. I have to write. So that's for the writers. For the readers, read what you enjoy. If you do enjoy something, let the author know. Leave an Amazon review, a Goodreads review, send an email, through their website. Say I really enjoyed whatever, because it is so difficult to write with all the rejection and stuff. It's nice to get positive feedback. I just got a feedback the other day from somebody I met at a conference a couple of years ago, and they said, I purchased your book and it finally came up on my to read list, and I really enjoyed it. I wanted to tell you, Project Suicide, I thought you just hit the nail on the right amount of technical and stuff. Made my day.
No, I think that's great. And I love the fact that you also talk about the thick skin. I think that applies to everybody because, rejection and failure isn't a bad thing. It's how we learn and how we grow.
Right.
And so, and I think writers, artists, those who are in the movie industry, singers, everybody, who's on the, I really think that that's probably the biggest thing that you teach the rest of us is, failure is just one step to the path of where you want to be because it helps you learn and grow. And so,
and rejection is not always about not being good. Certainly sometimes it is, but a lot of times it's, for example, writing short stories. If you don't hit the theme that they're looking for, it's going to be rejected just on that basis.
Yeah.
It's or you're trying to get an agent or whatever, and they don't handle this genre, or they're looking for some other types of topics. It's not always about that. As a matter of fact, a lot of times it's not. I think there's a lot of good writers who get rejected for these ancillary reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but like I said, there's always there's a reason and a purpose, and you just got to find what that was and,
Right.
and keep moving forward. So yeah, it's definitely where we grow and overcoming obstacles. I mean, that's what we love stories to begin with because that's what we see characters do, and so
Right.
it's really what life is teaching us consistently all the time. It's polishing our diamond.
Right. I teach a workshop on using research in fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to tell people that it's like, the tendency is, especially with Google and all that stuff, how easy it is to get research. Things that used to take you weeks and months of laborious research back in the 1980s, for example, you can now do in an hour, almost literally. The tendency is to put too much in. Say, look how smart I am. I've learned all this. You want to learn it too. But that's not the point of your writing. The point of your writing is the characters, their trials and tribulations, their obstacles that they overcome, their motives, how they interact with each other. And you just use the research for the seasoning that kind of gets their attention and says, okay, this guy knows what he's talking about. So that's an important thing to not get caught up in, whether you're doing historical research or whether you're doing technical research, like in Project Suicide or whatever. Don't make it a technical manual. It's the characters and the plot and what they're doing and how they're interacting and how they're overcoming obstacles. That's what people are interested in.
Right. Yeah. Because overall, I mean, isn't that what we're all interested in real life is, where we can progressively find that whatever our finish line is.
Well, and if you think about it, writing, I always say writing is like a soup or a stew. It's 90%, you're distilling down people's lives. 95% of what people do is boring from day to day. And that's the water in the soup. The characters, their trials and tribulations, that's the meat and potatoes. Yeah. And the research, that's the spice.
Oh, I love that. That's awesome. Well, John, we're toward the end of the show, so I just want to say it's been a pleasure speaking with you today, and thank you for sharing your insights, your experiences. I know Dominic's gonna, when he's working on this on the back end, he'll appreciate you taking the time to, share with our listeners and with me today your perspectives. And knowledge, and hopefully they all take away something really interesting. We do look forward to your future works. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we go?
Well, I first want to say thanks for having me and pass on my condolences to Dominic. Also, if people want to get my books, they're in Amazon, Checkout Time and Project Suicide are on Amazon. They're in Barnes & Noble, wherever Ingram distributes. The easiest way to get them is checkouttimenovel.com, all one word, or projectsuicidenovel.com takes you right to Amazon. And if you enjoy them, as I hope you will, leave a review.
All right. Well, thank you. And we'll have all those in our show link down below. So you guys will be able to find all that information as well, and John's bio. So thank you so much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you, Virginia. My pleasure.
You're welcome.
And for our listeners, remember, life is story, and we can get our hands in the clay. Individually and collectively, we can write a new story. See you next time.
We want to take a moment to thank our wonderful listeners and supporters. Your continued support and sharing of our podcast helps us spread the transformative power of storytelling. If you enjoy our episodes, please rate and review us on your favorite platform and share the podcast with friends and family. For more enriching conversations and insights, subscribe to Language of the Soul podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you listen to podcasts. Follow us on social media and visit our Patreon website for the latest updates and exclusive content. Your support helps us continue to bring these important stories to life. If you'd like to support us further, consider joining our Patreon community for exclusive content and donation options. Every bit of support helps us reach more hearts and minds.